Well, that's called quantitative easing.
Hello, and welcome to the Disassembled Podcast. I'm your co-host, John Schwartz, and on today's episode, Travis and I are going to discuss innovations within technology and weapon systems in general.
When they started World War II, everyone had weapons and tanks. It wasn't like they started building in 1939. They had been building throughout the 30s.
Yeah, but the Russian tank program, it really begins when Hitler invades Russia.
True.
I mean, it doesn't. They had some stuff, but it was copied designs. And then even the early tank program after the war started still copied designs. But you get the T-34 out there within 2 years. And it's not, I know it's not that revolutionary. It's a very sturdy chassis with a load of armor plates put on and then a cannon on top. But still, in the middle of a war-torn nation with no money to begin with, we go through this multi-billion-dollar today research program. We build the factories at the same time we're doing the research program, and somehow that works. And it just wouldn't work today. I don't think we could do that. Things are more complicated today.
And we're less industrial, more software-oriented.
It would be very difficult, I think, to take just what we have available, the labor force that we have available today, and do that again.
Additionally, it's like we build factory-specific robots. Let me get right to it. We build single-process robots still. Specific welding-type robots, specific, motion robots. And yes, there are robots that are more machine learning-oriented that will do tasks. But instead of having 1 million people who build cars, we have 500,000 people and 50,000 robots. It is a shift that's happened. It's very specialized, automation-focused production. That's a big difference, is that when you had people who were actually factory workers, had specific skills, they could be retooled or refocused on a different project. But I think the future of robotics are robots that are capable of working on any product. Robots that live 100 years. Durable for 100 years.
Well, some parts.
Yeah. Not everything on a robot or any automation system is going to last that long. Wiring goes out or metal wears down, rust.
Right.
All the parts of a machine decay at different rates. It's very true.
Well, I think today a big deal is retooling, where, as you said, the general purpose, a human is a general purpose robot. Let me put it that way. You can get a human trained fairly quickly. To build a new robot to do something requires a lot of research and development, manufacturing. So it's easiest to do a robot that only does one thing. It's much easier to test, much easier to get requirements around, much easier to implement. And so that's, fine, but that means that if in the future we have a different need, we now have to build a completely different robot, which with a human, that's not a huge deal. You can retrain them up to a point. Whereas with the robots, you now have to do this R&D cycle on the robots every single new time you want to make a change. So rather than like in World War II, where we say, we've got all these machine tool people that know how to use machine tools. They can build you a tank, they can build you a car, they can build you a rocket. You have to say, well, I've got a program where I've got some of the work done, some of the machines that I need already. But to really finish the program, it's not about, can I give this to, a team and have them implement it? It's, now I need to give this to a team of guys who will build the thing that builds this for me. It's a whole nother layer of abstraction on top.
Now, let me say, based on that, it's more complex, takes longer, it's more specialized. Would that not reduce the ability to quickly go to war, build weapons for a new era, slows down the time you need to build up, other than if you bought weapons?
I think it's like, and you see this in the past, between the transition between these different, historical ages. It's always really lame when this happens, right? But there's some validity. the multi-thousand year period where the Near East transitioned from bronze into iron, you saw this same sudden climactic moment where all the political systems were shaken up and all of these formerly super powerful nations were destroyed. And a lot of that was due to technology. It was using newer weapons against the old weapons. Iron can claw through wood really easily. So now a wood shield is useless to you, things like that. Whereas bronze, not so. I think you had a 20th century where you see that kind of eking out, where you have suddenly this boom of technology that is very cheap to make based on these newer ideas. But then you quickly get to that point where we're stable and improvements from here on out are incremental, not exponential. Just like with iron, you discover it, you discover how to work it, and for the first few years, you're making everything out of iron. You invent the iron plowshare, you invent the iron sword, moving on from there. But it takes a really, really long time then for society to transition to a real iron economy where everybody's running on iron because iron is so expensive at the beginning. Kind of the same with nuclear or, flight or any of these other technologies we have today, where at first, if we wanted to put a nuclear reactor in the backyard, completely impossible. I mean, you wouldn't be able to build a building big enough to hold a nuclear reactor in 1945 in your backyard. But today, the Japanese have a miniaturized nuclear reactor that really can be buried in a backyard safely. So it's kind of like, we've moved along on the system, but it's not like they invented a fusion reactor. This is sort of just the opening of a new book, the opening of a new age. And so we had this period of really intense transition, and I think that's kind of over. So now, you ask, is it easier or harder to go to war? Well, it's harder to change. I'll give you that. But the changes aren't coming as quickly, so it's not a big deal. And now it's more, we've got weapons that are good enough. How can we build them really, really quickly and cheaply? Which we solved. That was the problem we were solving today. Not how can we develop the next weapon.
All right. Well, let me make a different point where it is the U.S. and Russia are the dominant arms producers and exporters in the world. Yes, there's also the Germans and a little bit the Israelis and the Chinese, but Ukraine. So there's maybe 8 or 9 major national players. But the U.S. and Russia, by selling huge contracts for airplanes, ships, and of course our light arms, bombs, and tanks. Even the Canadians are in on this. It allows developing or lesser powers to buy weapons, train on those weapons, develop those weapons further, but never actually develop their own domestic programs, never build those things in their own country.
Right.
Thus limiting not only the physical factories, but also the institutional knowledge doesn't develop in those places. So if they're ever going to learn, they have to come to the US or Russia. Their ideas will more be bent towards our views on armaments. So in a way, this is another example of limiting the proliferation of the development of weapons systems. So in that sense, people are either going to come to you or they're going to have to spend the billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people to really develop and test the system themselves. Instead of that, they can just print money, sell resources, buy your finished tank or aircraft, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's definitely part of the idea.
And hasn't it worked to some extent? I mean, most of the weapons makers have been weapons makers for an era. There are not a lot of new weapons makers coming on the scene. It's pretty saturated.
Definitely, they've been very successful. The approach that they've taken is indeed, it's different from what we used to have. And that's another part of this radical shift. In that you used to have, hundreds of years ago, weapons are made by craftsmen, and it's an expensive process. And then now we've come so far that weapons are cheap, but there's something different about that I think we also need to hit. It's not just that you lose expertise around building the weapon, you actually lose expertise around the weapon itself. For example, the weapon of today, at least by the United States military, is definitely the guided missile, right? We use them everywhere. We had this huge idea that we could conquer Iraq based only on guided missiles. Maybe a totally false idea, but that's the strategy.
Had a name.
Right. And so in the past, we would have built these things because the real use case is I want to get a bomb to a certain location anywhere in the world freely. And so in the past, what we would do is we would go out and we would get this big piece of metal and we'd put an engine on it. We'd strap bombs to the bottom of it and we'd train somebody to fly this death trap. And then he would go and he would drop these bombs on someone. But the real point was to drop the bomb, not to fly the plane. And so what we eventually realized is, you don't need a plane. Just make the bomb fly itself. And so that's the radical shift as well. It's not just, we can mass produce weaponry. We could do that for a while. We could stamp out swords or whatever. We could make, World War I proves that we can mass produce weaponry, small arms, things like that. We make tens of millions of rifles in that conflict. But this shift from how can I not only get the manufacturing automated, but then get the warfare automated. And so you go to a nation, you say, look, you're not even going to need an army because you don't need an army to use this stuff, and this is the best.
Interesting. And
what do you need an army if you have a fleet of surface-to-air and surface-to-surface missiles?
No, I completely agree. And let's take this point to the maxim, which is, why should we send anyone to war? Let's automate our tanks. Let's automate, have robotic soldiers who talk to citizens. Let's have robotic surveillance. Oh, wait, we have that. Let's have, robotic boats. Wait, the Navy already has that. We already have almost all these things as prototypes or in the field.
Well, it indicates to me that it actually is, for an example, Israel, where the Iron Dome schemes, they're putting up these anti-missile defense systems everywhere. And you can say, well, that can't really be automated by a human, because it's too fast. Human can't do it, so they'll do it with the machine. But really, the point of automation there is in the past, they would have just invaded Lebanon. And now they shoot down the missiles because it's actually cheaper than doing an invasion.
Right. It's actually more economically driven, right? You can't really profit off the death of a soldier, but you can really profit off saying, hey, Iron Dome worked, we need to buy 10 million more missiles for $10 billion.
And it's definitely not a appetite problem. They just invaded not too long ago.
Lebanon?
Lebanon. Just 10 years ago.
I remember watching TV in disbelief because I'd been there. The year before I had been there, 2005, they invaded the summer 2006.
Whereas, and you look at the time period then, that was Hezbollah, and that was sold to us as an Israeli problem, meaning it was regional and not international. Whereas now, today, we have ISIS, which is apparently an international problem, that everybody is going to die, and the Israelis, with all their weaponry, are just sitting right next to them, doing nothing. So we're led to believe. And I think that's because Iron Dome is cheaper than going after ISIS. They make money, you don't lose anybody, and it's effective, at least to the point that they need it. So what is the point for Israel now? And there's always been, ever since they started airstriking everybody with impunity, there's always, I think, been this international question of, will Israel, eventually invade and take over these different regimes next to them that are unfriendly to them? And with things like Iron Dome, as long as they can keep that production line going, cost effectively, I don't think they will. I think they'll remain isolated.
Now, I will say then, with this sort of missile defense idea, Star Wars, really, right? It all comes back to this. If we have enough missiles, we can stop their missiles before we get destroyed. And isn't that the American plan with Russia? Is we've opened up a base in Romania, we have bases in Estonia, in Latvia, bases in Poland.
This is our long-term strategy. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was created by us putting missiles into Turkey in the 50s. So it's not like this is a new idea at all.
60 years of this. But now we can prove it with a test case like Israel. Like, look, no Israelis died. Palestinian Hezbollah missiles, useless.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the other part of it, of having these support nations where we sell Western weapons, is it proves, as we talked about in Spain and other cases, the modern era, we use small wars to test and sell weapons. This current war against ISIS has shown Some American weapons, but more notably Russian weapons. Lots of advertisements for Russian weapons.
Yeah, I think the Toyota Hilux. This is all a large advertisement for the Toyota Hilux, which really is. I'm not kidding. It's the T-34 of our era. It goes anywhere. It apparently is nearly indestructible. It can take small arm fire. It can run over a landmine. It can get hit by an airstrike, and someone will keep going. You can mount anything on there. You can mount a 2-ton anti-aircraft gun from World War II on the back of that, blow holes through any wall in front of you, and drive around at 45 miles an hour. That is a machine. That is a T-34 without the armor.
Well, that begs the question is, at what time will terrorist organizations just get free weapons from corporations to promote their weapons? Or is that already happening? Have we been doing that with, the Mujahideen, with anti-aircraft weapons, right? I know those videos. I remember the videos of guys strapped to pine trees shooting rockets and, thinking it was really cool, but really dangerous. And, I mean, have we reached that point where we will start wars to sell weapons, purely?
I think that we've already started several to sell weapons, purely.
In the Middle East is that major market then, right? India too. Latin America.
We have all this conflict right now around Saudi, right?
Yeah.
Which is an area that, truthfully, the stated reasons we don't care about them anymore. One, they're landlocked, and all of our routes are sea routes. They don't have a navy, and we do, and it's big. It's bigger than anything else there. So they're not really a security risk. They don't really go along with us right now on a lot of our goals, for the region. They're starting to have their own ideas. So, they're not there. And then the oil itself that they've got, not only is it being sucked up by the Yemenis and everyone else, and they're having all these problems with it, they seem to be getting hit the hardest by this oil crisis. In the meantime, we've gone ahead and made ourselves oil self-sufficient. It's not cost effective right now, but it can happen. And so I look at Saudi and I say, what is the value of the Saudi relationship? They had that dumb threat a few weeks ago, we're going to sell all our treasuries, as if that paper was worth anything. And then two, as if they could sell it all at once. That's part of their pledge into our system, not the other way around.
Here's my one question on that. Yes, they sell them, but we've already sold them to the Saudis. They've already been paid for, right? I don't understand how that would really negatively affect. What, do they think it would negatively affect the value or the yields of so many being sold? I mean, it's a more complicated question. Selling sovereign bonds is what it is. It's a bond issued by a sovereign nation. It's a complicated situation with a lot of those, where we do get a lot of our funding through the sale of treasuries, and the price that we can sell our treasuries is important to us. But let me also say that throughout 2016, U.S. Treasury bonds have accounted for roughly 20%, 15 or 20% of the global positive yields. It's one of the only things generating any money now.
Well, that's called quantitative easing.
I guess so. Pro-America.
We don't create money. You can print money, right? But that's dumb. That's not what we actually do. That's not what they're talking about. We create treasuries and we create various instruments to get that done. It's not, a physical thing anymore. So when the Saudis come out and they say, "Oh, we're gonna get rid of 700 billion whatever," it's like you just go burn them and we will reprint some new ones. It's a fake system.
Right.
The only thing they do have a value there, and what those treasuries are, is collateral against
oil.
Their continued. No, it's not oil anymore. Oil doesn't matter anymore. It's a controversial statement I'm going to say right here in this show. Oil no longer matters to the United States.
I can agree.
Period.
I can agree with that.
It's still important. We still import it, but it's a cost problem now. It's not a sourcing problem. We've really figured it out in the United States, and I think most of the legal challenges are even over. Everyone got distracted with the fracking in Pennsylvania and missed out on the fracking everywhere else. And, the sand extraction and all these things that they're doing up in Canada right now. What it really is it's military, where they are extremely large buyers of military hardware, and they really at this point are locked in, I think. They're vendor locked. But you see it where they continue courting other people and they continue wanting to evolve their military, but they're still locked into us. And as long as they're locked into us, they'll be an ally. And that, I think, is what the United States really defines as an ally, is uses our weaponry. It's a requirement, one, to be a part of NATO. You have to switch over to using all of our stuff so that it can be interchangeable, as they say. But two, the military leads everything else. You join in with the military group, and then we drop a base in your country. And then, we put money into your country through the base. And then we drop a CIA hut in your country. And then we put money in through the CIA hut. So, what is it all about? And what is the whole Saudi conflict really about? It's not about oil. It's not about 9/11. It's about we want them to buy more weapons. We've been saying this for years about all the NATO states. We want them to buy more weapons. They're not pulling their weight. We've been saying that about the Middle East. Look, they're building up, but not fast enough to keep up with ISIS.
Right. You need the constant threat vectors from everywhere.
Constant threat vectors. And former, super partners like the Israelis who, in the 70s were picking up tanks out of the desert for scrap and redoing them. Now they're building their own weaponry that is not our weaponry, and they're selling us weaponry. So we need someone else in the region to move all of our weapons through.
Well, I will say, speaking of Middle Eastern allies, another side of this has been a repositioning, I think, actively against Saudi Arabia. I think American interest in Turkey, even though Turkey does seem undemocratic, Turkey is still an American ally. We still have bases there.
Well, there used to be 3 pillars after Iran. We'll call that. Iran was the 4th pillar, and it makes a cross. The top pillar was Turkey, and that was our main block against Soviet incursion. We put all our missiles there, and it also kind of was our it's not Europe, but it's right south of the middle of Europe. So it's in this nice base right in the middle. Then on the southern side, protecting the Gulf, protecting the Red Sea, all those types of things, keeping anybody from getting out of line. We've got our Saudi partners. And then we had Iran, which, after the Shah, we didn't have anymore. But long-term policy goal to get back, and it's looking like that's happening. The other one is one that's oft forgotten, but was very, very important to our strategy, and that's Libya, where Libya was the pillar that was in North Africa. That's where we moved all our guns through. We had these extensive relationships with this dictator we hated.
I think we had very, very close ties with Egypt, though, for years. Egypt was, for a while, a Soviet buyer of weapons, of policy, but later...
After the 50s and 60s, I think Egypt starts to decline in relevance for the United States, right?
To some extent.
After the Suez Crisis, for sure.
Yeah, they're more of a risky ally than a secure one.
Well, I think we continued to try, but the Egyptians themselves played the Cold War right for at least a while. And they were able to get us to play against each other over Egypt.
Yeah. Well, I still think, though, looking at who's against who, I think most of the major powers are aligned against Saudi Arabia. I think Turkey is definitely fighting them. The Iranians are fighting them.
Okay, but here's the thing. When you say most of the major powers, we've already identified that the major powers actually are Russia and the United States.
Yes.
Because it's a military interest, and we control all the weaponry. So the major powers are our blocks.
All right, so the regional powers.
And which are all funded and buy their weapons from the 2 major powers.
Right.
Which means that if they don't want a war, they could stop selling weapons. Stop supplying weapons. These things, right? That's the idea. And I don't think that either side at this, we're still selling weapons to the Saudis. But what we are doing is creating a culture that influences the Saudis to buy more weaponry. We want it to look like everyone is against them. We want to start these little bush wars. That way, Saudi always says, we need our good friend, the United States. We need their weapons.
Well, whoever our next president is will be pro-Saudi. That is my bet. Whoever it is. President Trump, President Hillary, they'd both be pro-Saudi. They're both rich people. They understand the mission. They understand how the deals work.
You have, multiple sides to that where you're right. Like the Bush family, they have relationships with the Bin Laden family, with the Saudi royal family, with all of these important Saudis. And then the Saudis themselves also have relationships to our government. And so if you have someone with a long history of Saudi acquaintance in office, I think that you do have probably a more likelihood of Saudi cooperation.
And I'm not really strong on Trump's background, but I'm sure he's at least tried to make relationships with them. I'm sure he'd like to have them in the future.
Trump is in construction.
But
the Saudis are in construction.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the end of the story.
Yeah.
I think that it often doesn't matter. That's the thing, is that we have all this importance put on Saudi Arabia. They are not important. No longer. The oil, practically worthless. And too much trouble getting it.
Well,
The people themselves, no longer an ally that you can hold on to. You know, it's become, we're the ultimate at that, right? We can go to China and we can say, hey, you've got all these human rights violations that we have in our own colonies, right? Well, that's Saudi. You know, for a long time, I think we could say, hey, you know, we've got these allies and they're great because there's all these things in the region that we need them to stop. Like, look, there's Iraq, there's Syria, there's possibly Egypt, all these things. There's Yemen. We really need a strong Saudi. But now we don't have those factors.
well, and then I guess where are we going next? I have a few theories. I still think, and I know you think Venezuela is not going to collapse. I still think there has to be a collapse there because it is such a big oil producer that either A, the collapse is the justification for price spikes, or B, the collapse of whatever civil war uprising will be a way to get U.S. influence back there.
Well, you said that you thought that the entire thing would fall apart, which I disagree with. I do not think that
Right. You do not.
sovereign integrity of Venezuela will change. But what will change, I agree, is Venezuela itself. I think they've actually already fallen apart. Just look at the statistics over the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
That is a nation that's already bottomed out, even with oil. And the oil they've got, we've always been kind of sold a certain bill of goods on it, I think, where it's of these qualities and it's in this amount and it's this easy to get. None of those things actually turn out to be true. You know, Venezuela is really valuable to us and people in the region as long as they're pumping out sweet crude for cheap. I think in the 1970s, it was much more expensive to build a refinery that could handle the heavy crude. So Venezuela itself, just over the last time period, has been classed out of the market because of the way that they did their oil business.
All right, that's fair.
And then they squandered it and did not reinvest the funding, obviously.
Right,
You know, the whole nation's fallen apart.
right. One of the major issues with Venezuela is 70% of their electricity was derived from hydroelectric dams and turbines.
Which just goes to show they don't use any electricity there.
Yeah, but I'm saying they did have a system that worked on hydroelectric, and they have not been able to sustain it. Didn't replace it with anything else, so they've had huge electricity problems for a good 10 years. Since 2003.
You know, I think it's sort of part of the same failing that you see everywhere else where, and Cuba is always the example, where they turn their economy over to a different, you know, I'm not going to call it a different system. We call it a different block, trading partners. And then when that block died, it was really difficult for them to do anything because their lack of natural resources. You know, they don't have any oil and they don't have any metal. And so that made it really difficult for them. You know, now you have buses pulled by donkeys and things like that. Venezuela at least has natural resources, even if their block is dying.
No, their block still includes the U.S., though.
Well,
Because contrary to any kind of propaganda, we still refine and purchase a lot of Venezuelan oil.
yeah, but that's part of the deal. You know, over time, you're going to see more American independence. So that is a dying block. If they are dependent on selling us that oil, you know, that story's over. Let me just put it that way. Especially with cheap oil from elsewhere. And especially with all this push. You know, if you think about it, if Elon Musk has his way, so to speak, in 50 years, there's not going to be any more cars. It's going to be all electric and it's going to be all self-driven. So it's going to be, you know, a system based on coal, not gas. And that is a huge user of oil imports. And then you have gas plants. Those, you know, we're also trying to shut down. If the eco people really get their way, that'll all become solar. wind, and possibly nuclear, maybe something else. And, a lot of these other kind of areas that we use that oil, like plastic production and stuff, we've already shipped that off. What do we need oil in 50 years if all the activists get their way? What's the point?
Did you even know this plan exists? I don't think you can handle this. I grew up in a storybook that I could write. City harder than Tabasco on some dynamite. Do anything to hear my mama.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Disassembled Podcast.
The Disassembled Podcast was produced by Travis Razor and John Schwartz. For more of our shows, go to disassembledpodcast.com, where we also have links to contact us and find us on social media. Please subscribe and give us a 5-star review on iTunes or Facebook. We value the feedback of our audience and look forward to hearing from you.
I brought my plastic ball so that you all can sing along. Words will only distract me from my great work. That's why I built this plastic submarine. You're sharper than any wow. Just sweeping bells away, and your good ideas will tuck you in at night.
When I created in a vacuum, I was so fresh, so clean, I sparkle any track that I blessed. People drove from miles just to say that they saw me. I never thought all this could happen from a hobby kid. And did it go to my head? Of course it did. My favorite band broke up and I still can't get over it, because they helped me get over it. There's still so much that I owe. Now when I leave for town, there's only 20 peeps at the show, and that's a get. How did it come to